I think you already did. Yeah.
Okay, so what we're going to do is the first part of it. Let me turn this over to Bruce Mazer, who's co-chair of Climate Reality Chicago Metro. He retired in 2019 and joined Climate Reality in 2020 after a long career as a marketing executive in the travel industry, including mass transit, airlines, cruise lines, and hotels. Why don't you go ahead, Bruce?
Okay.
Are we recorded? Because I didn't get a note. Usually you get one that says oh, I'm seeing it. Never
Yeah,
mind.
it's
Sorry.
there.
Okay.
Oh,
So thank you, everyone, for attending today's Chicago chapter member meeting on combating climate disinformation. As Tom mentioned, I'm Bruce Mainzer, co-chair of the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project, and I will be presenting alongside Tom, the other co-chair of the chapter. Now, our goal today is to equip you with the skills to identify disinformation and respond with factual information. Climate disinformation involves the deliberate spread of false information about climate change and climate action. It ranges from outright denial and conspiracy theories to subtler forms that create doubt about the urgency and feasibility of solutions like electric vehicles. This is especially critical in the US, as this year, as political reluctance during election years often creates a void filled by fossil fuel interests spreading disinformation through social and mainstream media. On our agenda today, Tom and I will present the first two sections on what we are seeing in terms of climate disinformation now, how we have little time to act to prevent the worst consequences of the climate emergency, and what we can do to promote actions to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, after the presentations, we will break out into groups to brainstorm actionable steps for the coming year to counter disinformation and advance climate action. So you all have to stay involved and pay attention because we're going to ask for your contributions at the end. Now to start, Tom will present the first section. Tom has extensive experience in manufacturing and information technology, retiring in 2018 as a chief information officer. He also co-chairs our chapter's EV transportation team with me. So take it away, Tom.
Okay. So the disinformation part, we'll talk about disinformation and we'll talk about the facts to counter the disinformation. So let's go into it right here now. So if we look at how this really kind of began with the tobacco industry, and it was famously said in 1969 that doubt is our product since it's the best means of competing with the body of facts that exist in the minds of the general public. It's also the means of establishing controversy. In many cases, it's not about the facts at all. It's about that. How do we make controversial things happen? And so how does this relate to the fossil fuel industry? So you can see kind of at the top of the screen here, you can see that back in 1954, the real fear was that laws would somehow be passed that, to control pollution of all things. In 78, Exxon said that they kind of were being honest when they said present thinking holds that man has, a window of maybe 5 to 10 years, and that's all before they have to make hard decisions that might become critical. As you move up to 82, they confessed, their scientists confessed that potentially catastrophic events, if fossil fuel is not reduced, doubling of atmospheric CO2 would result in an average global temperature rise of 3°C, which, by the way, is pretty accurate, actually, when we look at where we have, come since 1982. And they admitted then that these results are really in accord with the scientific consensus. But even though they kind of admitted those things, just a few years later, in 1989, they were starting to say the role of greenhouse gas is not well understood. And then
Notable. Yeah.
make sure you're please make sure you're on mute as we go through this part of the presentation. All right, so as we go to 97, there's a lot we really don't know about climate change, but we have time, no problem. And then the American Petroleum Institute in '98 said victory will be
Close in here or
achieved when
jacket or
somebody's talking. Could you please mute yourself? Thank you. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in the climate science. And as we get up to 2017, the American Petroleum Institute said CO2 is not a pollutant. More CO2 leads to faster, more robust plant growth, including stable food crops. Moderate warming would have a positive effect on humanity. Then the Trump administration in 2007 pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. And finally, in 2024, the API is launched an 8-figure disinformation program, which has now been launched. And you can see it here, 8-figure, huge spending. And basically, they're appealing to the fact that, really we can't afford between now and 2050, we have to really double down on current energy demands. We can't really afford to jeopardize our way of life by going to non-fossil fuel products, because those are what's dependable. And there's a link on the screen for that. It was described as one of the most successful deceptive PR campaigns maybe ever in history. And the strategy is to put as much blame on the consumer as possible. It's your fault, to get to net zero. And I want to mention here that, frankly, most of the emissions do come from the machines that we use to, our cars and in our homes and so forth, and in our businesses that burn fossil fuels versus the emissions from the actual source from those fossil fuel companies. And they know this. They know the consumer is not in a good place to control the situation. It basically ensures nothing changes. And so as we kind of look at a couple of points of disinformation, we see here EV growth stalls. It's all over the place. The CEO of Ford Motor Company, Jim Farley, is stating that his company is not advancing forward as quickly as originally planned for EVs due to consumer concerns. And then GM's Mary Barra touts gas-powered lineup and says, we will determine the timing. The customers will determine the timing for the EV transition. The EV market is hugely affected, though, by affordability options, and they're frankly not bringing affordable options like in China. Some of the most highly produced companies that produce in the highest volume of EVs are low-cost options. But they are starting to wake up to the problem. Ford has gone into a redesign, developing a $25,000 EV. GM will reintroduce this low-cost Bolt that they had before, that with the tax credit was down in the low 20s. They're going to bring that back. It'll be a little bit more efficient. And then they have an Equinox that's out, which is kind of expensive, but they have a $35,000 version coming very shortly. And Hyundai and Kia doing well too. So you can see a shift as if they understand the problem, but they're not really marketing these products. Now, what's at stake for these companies, though, whether it be automakers or whether it be the fossil fuel companies? If we look at the trillions of dollars in direct subsidies, which would be money paid from our tax dollars that are given according to the International Monetary Fund on a global basis in 2022, direct cash was over $1 trillion. If we add in the indirect subsidies, we're talking about $7+ trillion in indirect subsidies, such as tax credits and things like that. And then when we look at where this is going, you can see that natural gas is getting the most direct cash payments, the direct cash subsidies. But if you add in the indirect subsidies, it's the coal industry that's really getting the biggest deals, the best breaks, the most tax credits, which is really kind of alarming when, most of us know about coal. So what happens, for example, I'm telling you this because it's at stake. Their future, they know it's an existential threat, and they're coming back, fighting back very hard. But if we were to eliminate, for example, subsidies or have a carbon tax, 1.6 million lives would be saved around the world. Government revenues would rise about $4.4 trillion. and emissions would fall 34%, helping us get to where we need to be in 2030, and incomes would be redistributed. Not only would be able to maybe pay down debt, which is a huge problem right now, but it would benefit the rich, which benefits the rich much more than the poor. We'd be able to redistribute income to the poor. So let's talk about the facts now. I threw out what's going on here. So let's talk about some facts. So we look at how much the CO2, what kind of a problem is it? You can see on the left side, called the Keeling curve, the carbon dioxide concentration over time since 1960. And we're sitting at a staggering 427 parts per million. I mean, up in the last 4 years from about 421. And that 5 parts per million might not sound like a lot, but it's huge. It's a huge amount. And a lot of times people don't understand it's not just about annual emissions, it's about the cumulative emissions that are in the atmosphere and in our oceans. So if we look at cumulative CO2 emissions in millions of tons, the United States is 500 billion metric tons of emissions been put into the atmosphere. China's behind us, even though they're the biggest polluter today, they're right behind us at 284, and you can see down the list in 2021. This stuff is up there, and it's going to be up there for a long time. Well, how long a time? Well, let's look at that. If we look at the global warming potential of 3 major greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, which is 80% of greenhouse gases, is if that was to be considered a 1, in 20 years, in 2044, a 1, it would be the same. All the emissions that I've just talked about that's up in the atmosphere is going to be just as strong 100 years from now. Never mind what we're adding, 52 gigatons a year are being added to that, right? So at 100 years, and in 500 years, in 2564, it's still a 1. And in fact, it's going to last as much as 1,000 years. Let's look at methane. 11%, it is 83 times more powerful than carbon dioxide, and it drifts off. It goes down to about 30 by 2174, what's out there in 100 years, and then pretty negligible in 500 years. The bad thing about this is methane turns into water and guess what? Carbon dioxide when it breaks down. So that's pretty scary. And then we take a look at nitrous oxide, 3%, but look at this power, 273. And it's just as powerful 100 years from now, 273. So we have to take seriously not just the emissions, but the emissions being added to what's already there. And that's why in the last 4 years, it's such a dramatic problem what is happening now. So when I joined Climate Reality in 2020, the world was different than it is today. And we all need to think about that. And that's what I'm trying to bring here to the table. So what we have is we have a carbon budget of about 200 to 250 gigatons that we can add to contain global heating to about 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. But that's only 4 or 5 years. And that's why climate scientists are saying we got to cut emissions almost in half by 2030. And you can see the buildup from 1850 at 280 parts per million. Coal, oil, gas, land use. But then we have carbon sinks. And those are really good. The trouble is it's not 2020. It's 2024, and we're at 427 right now, just in the last 4 years. So it's a staggering increase in carbon because what we add and what's there is really the issue. So with that said, what do we got to do? Here's our historical emissions. This is the green is the plan to contain to 1.5, 43% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, 84% by 2050. And if we give up on that, which most scientists have already given up on that, and we say, well, let's look at what the chance would be for 2 degrees Celsius. Well, that's a 21%. It's more manageable, but it's still a huge amount within the next 5.5 years, 64% by 2050, etc. But where are we? Well, right now, current policies are in this blue zone right here. It's actually going up. Emissions are increasing, even though US it's dropping a little bit. global emissions around the world are going up. Even with all the wind power and the solar power and everything else, it's going up. So what are the scientists saying about this? Well, this is what they're saying. The Guardian did a survey of the IPCC scientists, and I think there's something like 1,000 of them, and they got 380 responses so far. Each one of these red boxes is what they said. So you can see a few scientists are saying, hey, we're going to be able to keep it below 1.5 degrees. But 77% of the scientists are in this box right here. And then almost half are in the 3. We're going to hit 3 degrees or above. And, only about 6% say we're over here. So we have an extremely serious problem. It's a problem much worse now than it was 4 or 5 years ago because of this cumulative increase in emissions. And we start to see this every day. And so what's the impact of this? Well, there's a few impacts I want to tell you about. One is the temperature rise, and we know this. We're now sitting of a 5-year average at 1.45 degrees Celsius. And some fake news people will say, well, it's not us. It's not us. It's the rotation. I mean, it's the Earth going around the sun, right? It's the solar heating. That's the problem. Or it's the volcano eruptions. Well, these natural drivers are down here in green. Insignificant. Fake. Here's the ocean. This is the ocean rise. These are facts. Undeniable facts. How about this impact? Storms, pre-climate, now 5 1-in-100-year storms with 2 degrees, which is right around the corner here. We'll be up to 20 of these. And frankly, in 2024, we're probably halfway between these two things. And then if we go over here to the 1-in-20-year storms, of course, much more of these, we're talking about now at about 20 of these happen every year. And then that's going to rise at 2 degrees to 50. Now, if we look at massive precipitation, if I think one of the gentlemen on the call tonight is in the Northwest, they get a lot of rain anyway, and the impact seems to be lower there. But as we look around the country, where we are here in Climate Reality Chicago, it's expected to go up 45%. In the Northeast, 60%. So this is the consequence of this emissions rise in this cumulative emissions. Now, if we look at this impact, this would be fires. So North America, wildfires in Western North America, which is mostly where it happens. You see not much difference down here in the early days, but as we get into 2010, we're now up to about this over here. I mean, we're talking about 7 million acres in the 2020s is the way it's looking right now. And if we look at what David Attenborough has to say, if we go back to 1937, you can see the population here, 2.3 billion, 280 parts per million of CO2, about 67% of the wilderness. But the latest number from David is 2020, 4 years ago, 7.8 billion, 415 parts per million, 35% of wilderness areas are left. And the real bad thing isn't just the wonderful, beautiful wildernesses, it's the fact that they're a sink. And as we increase our emissions, we depend on these trees to absorb these emissions. But guess what? They're going down. So I don't really have to tell you about the massive numbers of catastrophes. Like $25 trillion between 2050 now and 2050 projected because of events like this. We're seeing this on the news every day, catastrophes, floods, and everything. So we're not going to do that here tonight, because even though a lot of what I've said is serious, it's serious and maybe even a little depressing, we want to now move on to this disinformation and some facts and what we can do about this. So right now, I'm going to turn this over to Bruce. Bruce, take it away.
All right. Thank you. So if we can go to the next slide. So we are all seeing disinfo increase this year as fossil fuel interests ramp up their misinfo on social media and even mainstream media repeat the views that climate solutions like autos and solar panels are not ready for prime time. I'm sure you've all seen that kind of news story lately. And it's important that in our activities, we not further the disinfo and these recommendations. So from the European Union, on their climate change page, they put out what I thought was a very good way to recognize and counter climate disinfo. First is to report disinfo when you see it. And second, which I'm sometimes guilty of, and I have to stop, don't engage with disinformation posts on social media, as this will only amplify the message and give it more attention. And help to spread correct information through your channels and networks, online and offline. So we should all be even more aggressive now in using our platform to get the word out. What are the facts and what are the solutions? And of course, be aware of your own biases and get information from diverse sources for a balanced perspective. So next slide, please. So this was an article in The Guardian last April, and I thought it was very good because it allows you to recognize what all those advertising dollars that are being spent by the fossil fuel industry are doing. The article describes it as the fossil fuel industry as coalescing around 5 talking points. One is energy security. The fossil fuel industry loves to trumpet its role in keeping the world safe, even when it is engaging in pursuing more drilling and more fossil fuel burning, which makes us less secure. The fact is the US military lists climate change and continuing to burn fossil fuel as the major threat to world peace. Then you have the economy versus the environment. The fossil fuel industry has harnessed this theme repeatedly for decades, that taking care of the environment is bad for the economy, saying that it would just be way too expensive to act on climate, and that in any case, climate change was not going to be a big deal, so the best thing to do would be to do nothing. Third one is a doozy. We make your life work. The fossil fuel industry loves to argue that it makes the world work, from keeping the lights on to keeping us riveted by smartphones and TV and clothed in the latest fashion. It's really genius. Create a product, create demand for the product, and then shift the blame to consumers, not just for buying it, but also for its associated impacts. The next one that are a lot of the ads and the commercials are, we're part of the solutions. A lot of the advertising I'm seeing is that the oil companies are actively working on solutions, when in reality, they are spending just a pittance on real solutions and continuing to drill and expand their fossil fuel capacities. We also see it in the industry's embrace of the term low carbon, to describe not only fossil fuel enabling solutions like carbon capture, but also natural gas, which is misnamed. It should be called methane gas, which industry lobbyists are successfully selling to politicians as a climate solution. And then you finally have the world's greatest neighbor, just in case people still aren't accepting of dirty air, dirty water, and climate change. The fossil fuel industry funds museums, sports, aquariums, and schools, serving the dual purpose of cleaning up its image. But I'd like to note that in the Chicago chapter, we have members Jeff Green and Pam Tate, who worked along with other groups to get Chicago to file a lawsuit, the city of Chicago to file a lawsuit against 5 major oil companies. So we are actively in the fight to hold these companies accountable. Next slide. So if we are going to address how to attack the emission problem, we need to understand the big picture. And this gives us the picture. This is a pie chart of where emissions are coming from in the US. And the largest source of emissions is transportation. And these are largely emissions produced by each of us as individuals, driving our passenger cars and light duty trucks. So close to 60% of the transportation sector pie slice you see there is from our personal cars and our personal light duty trucks, not industry, not military, it's ours. And 70% of that slice for the electricity pie slice is also due to us as individuals, because that 70% is consumed by households. And finally, a little more than half of the emissions directly coming from buildings, our homes or our apartment buildings, are coming from residential buildings. These are mostly natural gas furnaces and are used to heat our homes. So next slide. So based on the household usage of those three slices I showed you, over 40% of all greenhouse gases can be eliminated if everybody in the US makes the right choices with respect to their household decisions, their cars, their household appliances. This is a statement from Rewiring America. It's a great organization as to why it's important to electrify all of our machines, and I'll read it. Around 42% of the United States carbon emissions come from our homes and the vehicles we drive. Simply switching everything in our lives to be powered by electricity from renewable energy will go a long way toward getting our emissions down and reducing the impact of climate change. Rewiring America estimates that to achieve zero emissions, we need to install 1 billion new machines or 50 million machines a year for the next 20 to 25 years. It's a lot, but it's very doable if everyone stops buying fossil fuel machines. As a bonus, you'll also get better performance and lower utility bills from your new electric appliances. Now, hold on the slide a little while longer, because we at Chicago Climate Reality are not arguing or not urging everybody to go out and buy new appliances now. Instead, we should all be aware of the fossil fuel machines that are operating in your household, gas furnaces, stoves, hot water heater, etc., and your vehicle. And it's important that once these appliances or cars reach the end of their useful life, whether they will be for a couple of years or let's say 10 to 12 years because you just recently bought that machine, it's critical that you be ready to replace that machine with a machine that does not burn fossil fuel and continue to contribute to the climate crisis. Because when you replace your car or your gas furnace with another gas-powered car or newer gas furnace, you are committing to another 8 to 12 years of burning fossil fuels as long as that apparatus is operating. And that is a huge problem for the planet. And it also commits you, in very many cases, to continue to pay higher utility costs or expensive gasoline to power your car for another substantial amount of time. Next slide, please. So during this period where politicians are not talking about solutions to the climate crisis, and mainstream news and social media repeat the myths that are being spread that climate solutions do not exist now, or we are not ready for EVs or heat pumps, or we have time to solve the climate crisis, we at the Chicago chapter of the Climate Reality Project are doubling down on the pledge that we have prepared to have the general public commit to replacing all their fossil fuel machines with electric machines. Slide 20, the next one. So we at the Chicago chapter have made the pledge front and center on our website. And in 2024, it still remains a major focus of our efforts. And you can go to that website and get helpful links to help you find contractors and other sources. And also we have links to the Rewiring America's website on there as well. Next slide, please. Now, of course, in this meeting, we are talking to an audience in Chicago and in other chapters around the country, to activists who have been pressuring organizations to step up and meet today's climate challenge. These activities remain very important to us, so we have a second part of the pledge to guide us in our actions. We need to continue to push through this period of disinfo and skepticism about climate solutions. So we need more people to write more, talk more, be more visible, get on radio stations and in newspapers to extend our message. We're going to need all of you at the end of this session in breakout groups, as I warned you, to help us come up with ways that our chapter and other chapters can further this message. So next slide, please. Now, I mentioned already that a big resource for us is the Rewiring America. So I just show this here, and I urge everybody on this website to, if you haven't already, consult with this website. It's just a great resource for finding out all you can do in your households and to show other people what they can do to make a big difference in continuing to make progress to address the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So, as an example of the kinds of improvements you can make in your carbon footprint, we just took here some examples of the savings of changing your house to be on the grid, to using rooftop solar panels, electric vehicles, using a heat pump instead of a gas furnace, and an electric water heater. And these are the biggest difference makers you can get in your household. And combined, just these 4 items cause close to 19 metric tons of emissions, and you can lower that by 7 metric tons, which is a big deal. Now, obviously, if you have more than one car, these go up astronomically, but this is just an example of the savings you can get in your own carbon footprint. Next slide, please. And to counter the disinfo, I also like to show that a lot of even the car manufacturers are saying that EVs are too expensive, and it's important that we fight through this. So I'm always showing this example, and here, because Americans like SUVs, I compare a VW ID4, which right now gets the federal $7,500 incentive, and with a Nissan Rogue. And frankly, a Nissan Rogue, in my opinion, is not as nice a car as a VW ID4, but as a comparison purposes, they're about the same size. And there's no argument that you're better off with an electric vehicle. Obviously, the fuel costs down there, you're going to pay well less than half. And that estimate is based on a mix of public charging and charging in your garage or at your home. But in reality, most people rarely are charging their electric vehicles on the at fast chargers, unless if they live in a place where they can charge at home. And so the fuel costs, I think, savings are conservative in here. The federal incentive, though, isn't always needed, because if you look at the 5-year cost of operating an EV, and here I have the Kia Niro electric, that car doesn't right now qualify for the federal incentive, but it's still over a 5-year period going to be about the same as a Nissan Rogue. And if you operate the car for longer than 5 years, that car becomes even cheaper to operate for total cost of ownership. So, and again, this is very conservative estimates. For example, I've had 2 EVs and I've never had to spend a dime on maintenance. So, some of these numbers are plugged for replacing tires or taking a certain percentage of what may happen. In reality, you talk to most EV owners and they're not spending anything on maintenance or repairs. So, next slide, please. So, another part of countering the disinfo is we're hearing right now that hybrids are an effective bridge solution because the American marketplace is not ready for EVs. And that's just not true. It's more of a reflection, as Tom showed on the slide in his section, that the American car manufacturers just made a terrible strategic mistake in introducing cars that were at the Tesla price point instead of introducing cars that were lower priced and achievable. But going to a hybrid is not going to solve much. And I want you to look at the red bars here for how much tailpipe emissions are causing in terms of grams per mile, or how many metric tons of emissions are responsible. And here you have the plug-in hybrid, which looks pretty good in terms of reducing the emissions, but this is a car where you're going to have to buy two technologies. You're going to have to buy the technology for a battery electric propulsion, and you're going to have to buy the internal combustion engine. So that's going to raise the price point of the hybrid, and plus that tailpipe emissions will never go away. Now, if you look at the electric vehicle, that the blue bar is upstream emissions, or emissions from the grid. Now, if you're on solar, and you're getting all your power for solar, that removes it down to zero, and then what's remaining is the emissions that were required to manufacture the car and the battery, or whatever. But even if you are going to power your car on the grid, that electric vehicle, as more renewable energy comes onto the grid, that electric vehicle will become even more efficient and have even less emissions. So over time, you're talking about one vehicle, the hybrid or the plug-in hybrid, that will continue to emit emissions and not change. And your vehicle, the electric vehicle, will not only have far lower emissions, but will continue to improve as the grid improves. Next slide, please. Now, I just think that I want to end my section on what we think that we should do to recognize and combat climate disinformation. And here's a great way to counter the disinfo on EVs and basically now, or for all climate issues, because we should really make sure that we're not afraid to identify disinformation, notice the threats, recognize who are the powerful players behind, and make sure you know the tactics, which we've discussed. And there's a word that is now being used to counter, and that's pre-bunking, which means advocating for change before and getting the word out, instead of leaving this environment in a vacuum and letting the disinfo take over. So we're asking everybody not to stay silent. Next slide. So some people call it pre-bunking. I love that word. Other people say inoculate. So, prepare the marketplace for and give arguments as to why acting on climate change is important now. And I really like what this journalist said here, that we should recognize that the disinformation that we are seeing have shifted tactics. Basically, the old climate denial, that it's never happened, or what Tom discussed as, not even believing that the climate is changing. We're now moving to something a little more sophisticated, where they're saying that they're questioning whether solutions like heat pumps and electric vehicles will make a difference, or that we've got time, that scientists are working on it and it's all good news. So this is again talking about how to get out ahead of the disinfo, and using facts and I like the word, somebody said they like the word debunking. I also like the word inoculate. So on the next slide, I'd like to end our presentation, Tom and my presentation, on the one thing we all have to remember is if the solution involves burning fossil fuels, it's not a solution. So that needs to, as we address what to do for climate change, we need to reject the messages that, natural gas is a bridge fuel, or we need to continue drilling for oil because it's about security, and over time we'll be able to address it. We need to basically just stop burning fossil fuels. So with that, we're going to go into our breakout groups. And I believe that what we're going to do, I think there's about 35 people. And so, Tom, are you thinking 5 people per group? We'll have 7 groups or more? You're on mute, sorry.